Welcome to the ExecMBA podcast. I'm your host, Brett Twitty, and you are listening to a new episode. So in this episode of the podcast, we welcome back an old friend, Director of Student Affairs, Laura Bordoni. She's been on the podcast a couple times now, and we invited her back to talk about what's feels like popular topic always with executive format students, time management. I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation, particularly if you're an incoming student in our Executive MBA class of 2022, or even if you're just beginning to think about an Executive MBA program. So without further ado, here's my interview with Director of Student Affairs, Laura Bordoni. Laura, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Brett. It's great to be back.
I know. Feels like you were just on here just a few episodes ago. We ought to have a regular segment where we just invite Laura Bordoni onto the podcast, just an update about what's going on with the program.
That's right. I mean, give the fans what they want, right?
By popular demand. I can't wait to introduce it.
I just declared that myself.
So for our listeners who are new to the podcast, may not have a chance to have heard your prior episodes, tell us a little bit more about you. What do you do? How do you support students?
Absolutely. So I serve as the Director of Student Affairs and Engagement for our Executive MBA students. And what that means is I support students in kind of two big categories. On an individual basis, I provide academic advising. So an example is right now our class of 2021 students are going through electives bidding. So they are selecting their upcoming electives. And so I've been having a lot of conversations with students about what might be interesting for them to take, completing independent studies. So a lot of academic advising and then general advising as well. So working with students on topics that I think we'll cover today: time management, working with your learning team, choosing whether or not to take on a leadership role while you're at Darden, whether, if you're facing a personal challenge. So pretty big bucket. And then also kind of liaise between our students and the rest of Darden and UVA. So an example would be, if you want to do an independent study, I try to help students navigate, what faculty member might be a good partner for you, things like that. So the individual, and then I also work on things that impact the whole cohort as well. So overseeing our student clubs and groups. We have quite a few student leaders. And we have new clubs launching all the time, which is fantastic. So I partner there. I also oversee things like our speaker events, really any extracurriculars that are happening outside of the program. And then, sort of general strategic questions that come up to the program leadership level. So, policy changes, when we get feedback from students on different things, how can we implement changes? Right now, scenario planning for what the fall might look like, things like that. But a lot of my role is giving a voice to the students themselves. Darden really is dedicated to sort of a student-led, student-governed experience. And so I'm here to try to just give voice to that and be supportive. And then me personally, I got my MBA many years ago, worked in industry, but ultimately just felt a passion for higher ed and wanted to come back this way, and was so excited to have the Roslyn presence up here. I live in McLean with my husband and my young daughter. So it's been great to be part of the family, including yourself, that's building out our Roslyn presence here for Darden.
And it's been a really profound few years for that presence. Both sections are now located here in the Washington, D.C. area. We were always wondering, gosh, wouldn't it be great to do a regular sort of extracurricular speaker series? Well, we've got that now. It's Friday Night Live. We have now 8 student organizations, maybe not all of those official student organizations, but last count that I saw, it looked like there was at least close to 7, 8, something like that. With the addition of Money Matters and the Consulting Club.
That's right.
So a lot is happening in the Executive MBA program. I think our prospective students, we try to underscore for them, this is a very full experience. This is not just I come to class and go home. This is not transactional. This is all about, being part of an Executive MBA community and you being fully invested in what happens both in the classroom and outside the classroom.
That's right. It is a very full experience, which is fantastic, and it's a unique challenge for our executive students as well, where they have a full-time job. Many of them have family members or social lives at home that they're also balancing. So they've got a lot on their plate, and there's a lot to take advantage of, and that can be that can be challenging but exciting to navigate.
Which kind of brings us to our topic today.
Mm-hmm.
Figured that we'd get together. We talk a lot about students and how they're experiencing the program and the adjustment of balancing work life in school, which is as much a time question as it is anything else. And so I thought it would be fun, given that the start of school is just over the horizon. We start
Mm-hmm.
mid-August. We've certainly been spending a lot of time talking about the start of school over the past few weeks, and it's always something that we think about this time of year. So figured it'd be good to start the ball rolling with a podcast episode all about time management. But before we get there, let's sort of ask a slightly different question. For you, as you work with students, what's typically the biggest adjustment for executive format students as they start the program?
Sure, and I think it does kind of get into our topic. It's different for every student, right? Some students come in having gotten another graduate degree pretty recently, and so this is more familiar territory. Others have not been in school for well over a decade. Some have young children at home. Some are traveling from afar. So it really can depend on the student and varies. And I think one of the amazing things about the program is I see students finding support with others who are going through a similar experience, or just supporting each other regardless of where they're coming from. But I would say, if I had to generalize, the biggest adjustment probably is finding balance. And I mean that in many different ways. So there's the topic, that I think we'll talk more today about, of work, life, and school balance. So how do you create space for each of those things and still take care of yourself? There's the trying to find the balance of what is good or good enough versus what is perfect. Kind of learning the lesson that you may not be able to ace every class, be perfect at school, be present at home, and be healthy. So what might have to give? How do you prioritize? There's the balance of academics versus extracurricular. You're asking yourself, what are you really trying to get out of this experience, and where do you want to focus your time and energy? And then there's the balance of, really being independent and kind of taking things on your own versus, asking for help and relying on others. So that can be a big adjustment as well. Many students, have been tremendously successful in their career. They're high achieving and may not be, readily open to asking for help. And a lot of this program, relies on reaching out to your learning team, your faculty, asking for help. So I think finding balance is kind of the broad bucket that I put all of those different things into as a big adjustment for folks. Of the program really forces you to, to think about how you're going to prioritize among everything, and confront that you can't necessarily excel perfectly at everything. And what I like to tell students is that's all part of the experience of becoming a leader. This is so much of what leaders do, have to do on a daily basis. And so as much as the academic learning and the networking is part of the experience as well, so is this adjustment that, and the topic we'll talk about today, that's a huge part of the learning as you go through a program like this, and how rigorous it is.
There's so much there that I think is challenging for students. I mean, I think about the figuring out what's good enough versus what's perfect. It sounds really weird to say that to prospective students,
Mm-hmm.
that's something that you learn along the way. It sounds like, oh, aren't you just settling? Aren't you just compromising? And I don't think of it that way, actually, when I talk to our executive format students. I think ultimately the way that I look at that is that's not settling or compromising, it's prioritizing.
Mm-hmm.
It's choosing how you use your time most effectively. And is using your time most effectively devoting another hour or two to this case prep, or is it choosing to spend it in another direction, recognizing that time is a limited, finite resource? And that line is something that certainly, when you think about the learning curve of the first 5-6 months, how to be prepared for class, how much work, kind of gets you there and allows you to have a perspective and contribute, but isn't also overkill. That's also part of the process. And I think there's, I think for every student, there's a different challenge Some students will find some quarters easier than others. So in many ways, the program's rhythm is in these 2-month increments. And of course, because your life does not stay static as you go through this, that will also have a lot to say with what your priorities may be in that given 2-month increment. But you make so many good points about sorting through all of this and how essentially being able to do that effectively is an essential ingredient for effective leaders. So, in an effective leadership. So, let's talk a little bit more about time, though, because I do think it is running in the background of all of this, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's prioritization or figuring out where that line is, how do you know you've done enough to be prepared? How long do you find that it typically takes students to hone in on a schedule and kind of say, okay, I know how all of this works?
Oh, a couple days. No, I joke, but there are some students who come in and have a plan already and have a good schedule, and they're off and running. I'll be honest, many students, it does take that sort of that fall semester is what I've seen. You start LR1, and that's a whirlwind of a week where you're, in class every morning, you're working with your learning team at night, and you're not really quite in the traditional schedule groove yet. And then Q1 and Q2 are pretty rigorous academic quarters, and you're in the drinking from the fire hose phase of wanting to meet all your classmates, and so I typically find that it takes students through that fall semester. And when they come back in January, Q3 is also a challenging quarter, but it seems that at that point it's more of an academic challenge for students, less about a time management challenge. But I've seen, while I say fall semester, I certainly see students learning as they go, working with each other. And I think that, so it varies quite a bit, but I think that by the time that fall semester ends, most students are, one, feeling very ready for the holiday break, but two, feeling like they're getting into a groove.
We used to say, oh, well, you just need to go through a domestic and a global quarter, and then you kind of have it all figured out. But that terminology doesn't really apply anymore because now the trips have been moved, the global residencies, or have been moved to these travel periods, which occur, at least they start a little bit later in the program, which I think is kind of nice for students.
Mm-hmm.
The first one is not until, well, at least for the class of 2022, the first one is not until February of 2021 after quarter three. So hopefully by then you kind of gotten a little bit more settled. If you're traveling in that first travel period, probably looking forward to traveling, whereas we used to travel a little bit earlier in the program. And I always thought that hit students maybe just a touch too early when they were still trying to figure things out.
I think that's right. And I think one of the other things I've seen, which is why I say it takes students a little bit more time, is I would say by the end of Q1, you learn the rhythm of your Tuesday, Thursday evening class, you're preparing for on-grounds. You go through 2 full on-grounds and you feel that experience. And then there's the exam period. And that I think is definitely another time management adjustment to learn. And that's where I think it takes that fall semester to go through one full exam period and then start classes, almost right away. Now, the class of 2022 will have, a little bit more breathing room here and there, but learning what that transition feels like, where you really kind of have to, stay on top of the next quarter as it's upon you so quickly. And students learn, so I see some students who front load all of their exams so that they can give themselves a little bit more of a break, whereas other students say, no, I want to kind of spread things out. And so that's where it does take a little bit of time to get into that rhythm. I think the other thing that takes time, a little bit tangential here, is figuring out your learning team and kind of your shared learning experience approach. So, we assign students learning teams at the start, and that takes a rhythm to get into it as well. Of when do we meet? How do we think about tackling the work and preparing for on-grounds together? So it goes beyond just getting used to the schedule, but it's also figuring out what your working style is and how you work well with others.
We had a webinar not so long ago about learning teams, review sessions, and more, all the ways that students collaborate. to manage the workload of the program and to work together towards this common goal of graduation. And I think to a person, this was the most collaborative learning experience the students had ever had, right? So coming to Darden, being part of the Executive MBA program, I think prior to this, even if people had done another graduate program, what they knew was a little bit more of an individualistic approach where I'm doing the work on my own and I'm coming to class, but it's, I might have the occasional group project, but I'm not really actively working with a small group to help manage the workload. And Darden is so different than that, to really kind of have some balance and to be able to manage everything that's coming your way and do all these things that we're talking about. You really do need to have that learning team or small group to help you along, because that group is not only a way of your managing the workload, they also help fill in your gaps. And so things that may not necessarily come as natural to you, well, you got someone there that might have that background and can really help you orient and understand the material. And you also get to have something of like a microcosm of the broader class discussion as a group. So as you're unpacking a case, there's things that your teammates will have thought about that had not occurred to you. So many benefits to that, but can't underscore enough that this will likely be the most collaborative learning experience students have ever had, not just in class, but also in terms of how students manage the workload and get through the program.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I think that is, again, as I mentioned earlier, one of the big lessons that takes a little bit of time for students is getting comfortable with that realization and that willingness to lean on other people, and that's okay, and that it's important, it's critical in this program. And I think I find, by the end of that fall semester, a lot of people have had that aha moment, and then head into the next couple of quarters, in a much better place.
That can be tough, though, for a highly motivated individual. I think people are. I mean, you also are potentially surrendering a little bit of control, right?
Right.
So you're doing all the reading, you're preparing for class, but you're also trusting that group, and that's an important lesson for any manager or any leader. That you will find that time in your career where you cannot do it all by yourself. You may have already found that time, but the group is a good reminder of that. That you're able to ultimately get a lot further in this program by traveling together than trying to travel alone. So I'm curious, so you work a lot with students. You had a lot of conversations with them as they navigate the early months of the program and honestly work towards graduation. What are some of the effective time management strategies you've seen people employ?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. It comes down to a couple things. One, as we started out the call talking about, the students who have a really clear set of priorities do really well in terms of time management, because they have said, okay, these are my 4 priorities. Here's the hierarchy, and then translate that into how they spend their time. I think, I've seen some students who think that they have prioritized right, but then they don't translate that into how they're spending their time. And that's where you can get into some challenges. So the students who say, okay, my priorities are work, school, spending X amount of time with my family and working out every day or something like that, my physical health. And then they translate that into an actual really specific schedule that they stick to. And it's not just a school schedule. It's, they have time for, okay, Wednesday night is date night, or every single morning from 6 to 7 a.m. I'm going to work out, or, Saturday afternoon from 12 to 6 is totally off limits. I'm offline and I'm with my family. And they have sort of a rhythm and a very clear schedule that they've set for themselves, so that it is easier to prioritize and make sure that you aren't inadvertently spending time on things that aren't, that you should be putting on the back burner instead, if you want to do that. I often see those same students have set very clear expectations with themselves and with others around them. So they have communicated to spouses, partners, friends, this is the schedule, these are my priorities. so that they're supported in that, and folks are enabling them, and then that they're also held accountable. The students who say, every single from 7 to 9, I'm doing schoolwork no matter what, that, and you communicate that to people in your life, then that sets some clear boundaries for you. And that also enables you to say, okay, this is when I can do learning team meetings. I need to find folks who have a similar schedule to that. So I think it comes down to having clear priorities, translating that into a pretty clear schedule, and then communicating that to the other folks in your life. And then I think really tactically, I've heard some folks do things like, get rid of their TV, or, just, decide that they're not going to be a part of whatever, social group that they were a part of for some period of time. It can be difficult decisions that you have to force yourself to make. But being thoughtful and proactive about them versus more reactive and kind of letting things unfold. I've seen really successful, the program moves really quickly, and it can be challenging if you fall behind. So being very purposeful, I think is critical to success. I don't know if there's anything else, Brett. You've had lots of conversations with students that you've heard as well.
Well, I'm just struck by the fact that maybe John Prine was right all along when it comes to Executive MBA podcast, time management advice. I think he said, blow up your TV, throw away the papers, move to the country, build you a home. Some combination of that probably means that you have a clear sense of your priorities. So tribute to him. It's so rare we get to work in musical references here on the podcast. So I didn't want to let it go. But I will say, clear idea of your priorities. One of the things that students, I would say probably more so alumni than students, reflect upon is when the alumni were students in this program, they had such a clear sense of what was important to them. And then when you get back out into the real world, you're not balancing school anymore. It might get a little murkier because you got a little bit more time and you aren't forced to kind of budget in that same way. So if you can do some of that work now, I completely agree. Having those conversations with people at home and at work and helping them understand not just that you're doing this and what this might look like from a time standpoint, but why you're doing it, how they can be helpful to you, and continuing to have those conversations. I think sometimes I worry that people only really have those conversations prior to starting the program and don't check back in. And so I think it's really important to have that dialogue. I was struck, we had a conversation here on the podcast with Stephen Weir. Stephen basically said, my wife and I sit down and we look at the schedule every couple of months as we balance everything. And it's really important as a family to kind of think about these things and manage the time and calendar together and think about what we have coming up. And if that's your situation, if you have a partner, spouse, significant other, if you got kids, I would encourage you to take a similar approach, because I think that kind of inclusive time management is really appreciated, because everyone will tell you when you get to graduation, it's not just you've completed this program, it's we've completed this program. And for our students, that moment is not just about what they've done, but what we've collectively done. And it's a celebration of families and supporters as much as it is a celebration of the student and the student's accomplishment. So bringing them into that conversation, really understanding your priorities, and being almost hyper scheduled. I know it sounds odd, but it is easier for the people in your life to understand what you have going on if it's written down, if it's documented. And that's not just people at home or people at work, but it's also your learning team. So many students will report that they were hyper scheduled while they were in the program, including scheduling things like time with family, or throw the football with my son. And I know that sounds really strange, but if you put it on your calendar, you can hold yourself accountable, and you can also help other people in your life understand that that's non-negotiable time. That's time that has to be budgeted around. And it's just as important as a meeting, just as important as a distance class, just as important as a weekend residency. And so back to your priorities point, Laura, I think it really does all start by knowing very clearly what are the most important things and building around those non-negotiables.
I think that's right, Brad. And you raised another point that I've seen for really successful students is that they do build in time to reflect and adjust. Things move very quickly, and it can be easy to kind of just keep doing what you've been doing it may be that you are hyper scheduled and it's not working well for you, for your employer, for your spouse, whoever that may be. And, you know, I try to encourage students to do this in general in the program, but, you know, at the end of each quarter, or whenever is the right cadence for you, find an opportunity to just, to take a pause, sit with how things have gone, whether that's just personally or with other folks in your life, and regroup. And I recommend that from a time management standpoint. I also recommend it from a, you know, all of the things that I brought up at the beginning of the call about balance. You know, are you getting out of the program what you wanted to? Are you, you know, have you made some of the relationships that you were hoping to? How are things going at work? Just finding some space, which can be really hard, but to reflect on how things are going and then adjust if you need to, I think can be really important.
Absolutely. You know, as I think about students entering this program, there are a couple things that are always on my mind. One, the first few months are going to feel very intense to everyone, because you already have a very full life. So now you're trying to figure out how to fit Darden, which is known for being challenging. The case method, it asks a lot of students, but you get out a lot. And you get a lot out of it for that reason, but it'll take you a while to figure out how to read a case and how to contribute in class, how to be prepared for class. And there is always a moment in LR1, in the first leadership residency, in quarter one, quarter two, you know, where I know you have a lot of these conversations, but we'll also notice it as admissions professionals, because we're just around and we'll see the students. You can tell that they are feeling challenged, right? And feeling, gosh, how am I going to do this? If you can just sit with that feeling and just sort of accept that that's part of a process, I think that's a really important thing to acknowledge, that time and that feeling comes for everyone early in the program. No one is going to be perfect at this. Even if you've already done other school, you haven't done Darden, you haven't done a case method MBA yet. And if you can just remind yourself of that when that moment comes, I think that's really important, because every single person who's come to this program has had that feeling. And if you just keep moving forward, you'll get to a point where it'll all click for you. But there is a learning curve.
Absolutely. I do think that, and that's where it comes back to, you know, a lot of our students have historically maybe been more independent. But when you start to tell students you're not alone, everybody is feeling this way, or they start to open up to each other, there is this sense of relief of, oh gosh, okay, I'm not the only one who's overwhelmed. And so I always try to encourage students to speak up or to share with one another, and we try to foster that environment at LR1 as best we can, because that's absolutely right. At some point, everybody will feel overwhelmed, and I think, you know, one of the biggest pieces of advice I give to new students is to be patient, as you said, Brett. You know, this is going to take some time to get used to. There are going to be some adjustments. You may not get everything right, and it's okay, and it's part of the process. And you will get through it, and everyone is going through that as well. So, absolutely.
I think there's also a really big shift for adult learners. So most people knew school as the thing where you are trying to get the best grade all the time. And it's not to say that people are not motivated to do well in the program. But I do think when you come back at this particular juncture in your life and this particular juncture of your career, perhaps learning should be the motivator, or hopefully learning is the motivator, which is more of an it's more of an input question than a particular outcome question. Like, did I, you know, learn something? Did I, like, in the sense of, like, did I really kind of do the work necessary to get something out of this class? Am I reading the cases? Am I maximizing this experience? I think that is something you can control. And I think that has a lot to do with people's, you know, sort of general feelings about how the program is going. If you focus, this sort of basic, this is just, I mean, this is not complicated psychology, but this is an important thing. When students do struggle, and this is across graduate programs, typically they struggle because they're focusing on things that are beyond the scope of their control. Whereas if you can focus on things you can control, your preparation, how you sort of work to manage the program, work with a group, you know, ask for help, these things that clearly you can do something about, the rest of it will kind of fall into place. And I do think a learning orientation, if that can be your bellwether through the program, I think you'll find that you'll get way more out of it And it won't feel transactional at all because everything is a learning opportunity, whether it's having lunch with a colleague, going to Friday Night Live, class discussion, happy hour. You can learn something everywhere.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And like you said, many of our students are coming in and their last academic experience was undergrad, where it was all about your GPA. I shouldn't say it was all about it, but that was a really big focus, right? And, in this program, I do think the students' goals might be different than that, and maybe they should be, but that's a challenging adjustment. And we certainly have students who say, no, I am gunning for a perfect GPA or high academic honors, but the vast majority do come to that realization of, okay, I want to take away from this what will be most helpful for me and learn and learn as I go, but not necessarily need to achieve that highest grade. And that can be really hard to make that mental shift for people and accept that. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that's ultimately a question of priorities. All these things have trade-offs, right? So,
Right.
and so it's this kind of self-work, self-reflection. I'm always struck when we have these conversations with our career colleagues because they start all of career conversations with a lot of self-awareness and self-assessment. And I think as you're embarking upon this journey, if you can start with that, there's a lot of questions through the admissions process that are ask you motivational questions like, why do you want to do this? Why do you want to come to Darden? What are your career goals? If you can continue to check in with those things, but maybe even on a more micro level, I am doing this. What is most important to me? What are my goals? What do I want to get out of this? What do I need to feel supported as I do this? These kind of things, I think that can have a lot of impact. Laura, you and I have been talking a lot about academic prep over the past few weeks. We've got these academic prep sessions running, which have been great. And, business fundamentals is going to come in July as well. So I've been excited just to spend some time in the evenings with students as they learn a little bit more about decision analysis. Last night, very exciting, Robert Carraway, the second session in our decision analysis module led a discussion on net present value and the time value of money. Fantastic. It was great. Have all the students on there saying, would you take the deal? Would you not take the deal? Why would you? And I mean, if that doesn't feel like business school to people, I don't know. I don't know what does. But what advice do you give students as they think about brushing up? Because I know this is on our students' minds. People oftentimes wonder, do I have the right background? Is there anything I can be doing now to get ready?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where maybe I will talk out of both sides of my mouth, but on one hand, I like to tell students, look, especially our admitted students, you were admitted for a reason. People come into this program with very different backgrounds, and you shouldn't worry too much about it. There were resources to help you throughout the program. This is not a program that's exclusively for people that have a certain background or not. It's meant to be more of a generalist leadership program. And so, for some of the folks out there who are overly worried, I would say don't worry too much about that. Don't overthink it. Now, on the flip side, I will say, I think, I do recommend, especially if you don't have as strong of a quantitative background, that students, if they have the time and want to feel a little bit more comfortable heading into the start of school, that they do take advantage of the quantitative prep course, Brett, that you just mentioned. So all of those sessions will be recorded and available, and they're a fantastic way to see some of the the types of things that'll be tackled in some of those early quantitative courses and interact with those faculty members, or at least watch videos of them. And I think, half the battle can sometimes just be comfort. And so getting some of that exposure, even if you're not then sitting down and running problem sets afterwards, or, you don't have the time, but just starting to hear some of the terminology, see some of the faculty members, I think can be really helpful and reassuring. And to the extent that you get some of the nerves out for you, then you feel more ready to dive in when Q1 kicks off. So I certainly recommend the prep course, or at least checking it out. I also recommend that students take a look at business fundamentals early on, and many students sort of put it off and have said, I regret that. It's absolutely not required, to complete before LR1 starts, but it will become available in July, and so I think that it can be valuable to at least spend a little bit of time with that as well. Those two courses, if you will, or the prep review sessions and business fundamentals are really meant to prepare students for the start of school, especially students who maybe don't come from a more quantitative background. So I definitely highly recommend those. I mean, I think I would say otherwise, when you ask some of our more quantitative faculty members, they say things like, which feels general, but I do think it can be valuable of, peruse the Wall Street Journal, look for terms that you don't understand, follow a company and see how it's performing, and just try to dig into, what's going on kind of in the economy. I think can just be helpful to start to understand sort of general business speak. So, I recommend all of those, but again, I come back around to my first point as well, that if you don't have the time, it's okay. And there are resources once you get started. The faculty are very, open to working with students. You'll have a learning team. We're looking into some other potential ideas for academic support as well. So, and then I would say, going back to the rest of our conversation, I would recommend on the time management piece, start to give some thought to what will your priorities be, how will you divide up your time, and I say that because I think it can be helpful to think about that sooner rather than later in case it does have implications. So whether it's what type of childcare are we going to be looking at, what are my living arrangements, what professional commitments do I have coming up, and do I need to get out ahead of those with my manager? It can be helpful to look at the calendar and start to think about how you're going to divide up your time now while you have the time to think about it a little bit more.
A lot of good advice there. I really loved Bob Conroy's tip for our students, pick a company and follow that company for a couple of months on the stock market and read about them as you can. Try to understand what's going on with the company, what they're doing. We're only 2 sessions in. There are a total of 12 academic prep sessions, as you note, completely optional. If they work with your schedule, great. If they don't, they'll all be recorded. You can watch them if you want. I have really loved being online with the students and just seeing the sessions. And I think there's so much value in them. Even if you feel a little bit overwhelmed by the conversation and you're not 100% sure about what's going on, you are getting exposed to what's an online class like, what is a case discussion like, what does a case look like, what are some of the things I need to know how to do in Excel, right? You're going to do a fair amount of Excel work. So if you have not spent much time with Excel, know that that's going to be something that you may want to try to address, because ultimately some of the earliest classes you take are Excel oriented, right? So decision analysis, accounting, finance, being proficient in Excel can save you some time and some headaches. And so I've been struck by the fact that Robert, a lot of what he has been doing in these decision analysis prep sessions is just kind of talking about some basic Excel functions and how might you build an Excel document and come up with some of these calculations. And I imagine for some of our participants, it's the first time they've thought about using goal seek or a net present value calculation. But when they see it again, they will remember it. And they'll be like, oh yeah, I remember doing that. And so if we've diminished a few learning curves, that's great. And I hopefully at the end of the day, I've been struck that at least in our WhatsApp group, there's some suggestion that maybe students are talking about the cases as well offline, which is cool. I'm so pleased to hear that, because ideally, that's exciting to people. That is what Darden's about, that you're going to talk about these cases and there's no right answer, and it's about process and how did you get to the answer and why do you find this to be the best solution. And you can talk about some of these cases for a very long time. So it's been fun to be online and to see students not only get excited about the material, but also get excited about learning with each other. So So I would absolutely recommend those, and do what feels comfortable to you. We're offering a lot of stuff to try to help students stay engaged, not only with us, but with each other. But, do, whether it's a social thing or whether it's these prep sessions or whatever, do what fits with your schedule. We offer these as options, and we just want to make sure you have choices as to how you engage with your classmates. So if you're in our incoming class of 2022, know that there'll be no shortage of ways for you to stay connected in the coming weeks. So, Laura, any final tips, anything that you would share with our listeners?
Sure, and I think we've covered a lot of ground today, which is great. A lot of my tips have come up already, but the things that come to mind. So for those folks listening who are starting the program or perhaps even in the program already, some of the things we've talked about, like I said, be patient with yourself. Give yourself the time and space to learn that time management is all a part of this experience. So being patient with yourself, not being afraid to speak up when you start the program, as we've talked about, is one of the biggest mistakes I see many students make is that they don't speak up and until they're kind of more underwater. And I think that can be tough, but I do recommend it. I think trying to stay on top of things, the schedule, as we've talked about, moves quickly. And I think it's important to try to keep up and, again, raise the flag if you're not, if you feel like you're falling behind. And then I would say, as we've just listed all of the many ways that you can engage with us, I would say for admitted students, enjoy this time before the program starts. So, of course, as Brett said, do what works for your schedule. But also, again, don't go into the program already feeling burnt out or overwhelmed. Take the time now on a Tuesday night to watch a movie. Do the things that you may not have time to do starting in the fall. So I would say enjoy the time that you have right now and just be present with your life. And then I would say for anyone who's listening who's considering the program, I think it's a very meaningful decision, and make sure it's the right time for you. We've talked about all the demands of the program and how important it is to have your family and your employer on the same page. And so I think that's an important question to be asking yourself, if now feels right, and make sure you're talking to kind of all the stakeholders, if you will, in your life. And then I would say, make sure you're getting to know the programs. They're all different, and it's important to get a sense for priorities and values of the program. So listening to podcasts like this are really important, and hopefully we've helped shed some light on a big part of the Darden experience in terms of finding balance and managing your time.
Absolutely. There is maybe not a perfect time to go back to school, but there are better times where you have windows of opportunity. And so we welcome that conversation. If you're wondering that, if you're kind of wondering about balancing all these things that we've been talking about today, absolutely reach out, schedule a conversation. We can always be reached at exec, that's ExecMBA at darden.virginia.edu. And, speaking of movies, Laura, just want to throw this out there, for any of our incoming students or any of our prospective students, Back to the Future has found its way to Netflix, Back to the Future 1, 2, and 3. So whether you want to talk about time management or which of those movies is the best, I'm happy to have that conversation as well. So Laura, thank you for your time today. It's been great talking with you, and always great to have your expertise here on the podcast.
Likewise, Brett. Thanks so much for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
And that was my conversation with Laura Bordoni, Director of Student Affairs for our Executive MBA program. As always, if you have any comments, suggestions, requests, anything you'd like for us to cover here on the podcast, we're all ears. We can be reached at exec, that's ExecMBA at darden.virginia.edu. Until next time, stay safe, be well, and thanks for listening.